Poor George Bailey. If you've seen the movie, you know that George gets into some trouble. His uncle loses $8,000, which is about worth $170,000 today. And I don't know if you guys keep that lying around in your house or what, but that was something that was a big challenge for George. And he's afraid that he's about to go to jail for misappropriation of funds. And what does he do about that? Well, as you probably guessed from the clip, we're talking about drinking today. But not just drinking, because it can be tempting to look at drinking in isolation, right? And we ask questions as Christians about drinking. Is it a sin? Should a Christian drink? If so, how much? What about leaders? Are they different? And those are good questions, and we're going to talk about those a little bit, but I think that the biggest question about drinking is a big picture question. It's a much more important thing to ask. Rather than just talking about the rules, we should actually be talking about why we shouldn't use any mind-altering substance as a substitute for the power of God. All right, so if you're following along with your sermon notes this morning, today's message is called Bottoms Up. And today we're going to be in a very sobering passage. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 9, looking at verses 20 through 27. All right? So let me set up this story a little bit for you, okay? Anybody in here ever heard of the story of Noah's Ark? It's a familiar story to most of us, right? Well, here's what we learn about the situation in Genesis chapter 6, verses 9 through 11. Verse 9b, it says, Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. And Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. So we have Noah. He's a righteous man, right? He has 3 sons, and the world is just absolutely terrible. It's just a horrible place to be. And so God decides that he's going to destroy the entire world and remove all of its corruption from mankind. But that's not the end of the story, because in God's infinite grace and mercy, he still preserves mankind through this one righteous guy and his family. And so God sends this flood, all of humanity is wiped out, but Noah and his family are preserved on an ark, kind of like a giant boat. And clearly, if you can imagine being Noah for a second, right, this would have been probably a really powerful and humbling experience, right? To hear the voice of God, and he says, hey, build this giant boat, okay, put all these animals in it, now sit here and wait while it rains for 40 days and everything floods over. I mean, that'd be a pretty humbling experience, to know that everybody else gets wiped out, but God preserves you and your family. That's kind of a big deal. And so I'm sure that Noah he was probably in awe, right? And just kind of in shock in a good way. But if you think about it, though, one day, Noah had to step off the ark. And then he had to start over. All of humanity had to start over with this one guy and his family. And so during that process, we'll see that Noah is going to make a choice. And it's a choice that will again bring that corrupted nature of mankind back into the spotlight. Right? God wiped out everybody, but even though he kept a righteous man, all that darkness still came flooding back in. And it sets up shame and dysfunction for his family for generation upon generation. And really, it's a shame that really still spreads through us even today. And so the part of this story we're going to look at today is going to be a powerful reminder that trusting in anything other than God, whether it's substances like alcohol or drugs or any other form of corruptible help, it can have terrible consequences far beyond what we might expect. And it's rarely ever the thing itself that's the problem. It's usually not the substance that's the problem. It's what we do with it, and it's our heart in the matter that's the problem. Okay? So let's go ahead and read the story, and then we'll get into it. Genesis chapter 9, verses 20 through 27. It says, Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his 2 brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backward, and they did not see their father's nakedness. And when Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers. He also said, Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. Okay, so Noah was blessed by God. He was chosen out of all people to preserve mankind because of his righteousness. Okay? And so when he gets off this boat, he has to make a tough choice, right? What am I going to do now? I mean, do you ever think about what it would be like to be the last person on earth? I mean, if you ever watch the TV show Lost or the movie Castaway or any zombie movie or whatever, and you start thinking, man, what would it be like if I was the last person alive on earth and I had to reset mankind? Like, what would I do? Right? Like, clearly you start off by looting a convenience store or collecting coconuts and you make an axe out of an ice skate or whatever. But those are all things that you do to survive, right? It's just about getting from point A to point B with that. How do I get through this short time period? Because you're waiting for a rescue boat or to find other people or whatever. But here's the thing, Noah isn't just trying to survive until he gets rescued. This is a completely new beginning, right? He is solely responsible for rebuilding civilization from step one. So he has some choices. What do I do now? Well, he could just give up and just let it all go away. He could be a hunter, but considering that he only had 2 of every animal, you probably don't want to kill one of them, right? Because I don't know if you know this, but they couldn't keep reproducing. So, okay, just making sure you got it. Okay. Or he could just be a gatherer. I'm going to walk around and just try to take what I find, and I'm going to eat that, okay? But he thinks big picture, right? He wants to create some kind of infrastructure. So he plants a vineyard. He becomes a farmer. I'm going to be in control of how we're doing this. And that's a good thing, right? He gets to work. He's trying to rebuild. He's supporting his family. It's a really good plan. It's a good idea. And then the grapes start to grow, and he harvests them, and he presses them, and he stores the juice in some kind of a wineskin. So far, so good. But it's at this point that something starts to go wrong, and here's why, okay? If you grab your Connect card on the way in and you're filling in your blanks, here's your first one. Number 1, people who trust God are still vulnerable. People who trust God are still vulnerable. This still even applies to us today, right? As believers in Christ, our spirit has been restored, right? We've been born again, okay? But as long as we live in this life, even though our spirit has been renewed, we still carry around this bag of flesh with us, right? The flesh is still an issue that we have to deal with. It brings us down. And Paul actually explains this struggle in Romans 7:18. He says this, "For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is in my flesh. For I have the desire to do what is right, but not the ability to carry it out. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I keep on doing." So even as Christians, even though our spirit has been restored and we want good things, we don't always have the ability to do good things. So we still make mistakes. And that's what we see with Noah. Even though he knows God and he trusts God and he's considered to be a righteous man, his flesh still drags him down. And so Noah drinks his wine, which is not a problem by itself. Having a glass of wine, no big deal. But the problem is he didn't stop at 1 glass of wine. He kept going, and he was drinking more and more and more and more until he hardly seems like Noah anymore, and he passes out naked in his tent. So he made a choice that led him into a vulnerable, compromising position. And so we have to answer this question ourselves. It's a very common question for Christians to ask ourselves. Is drinking alcohol a sin? Well, personally, I think that that's far too simple a question to ask. If the question was simply, is drinking alcohol always a sin? Well, that's an easy answer. No, it's not always a sin. I think it's very clear that it's not always a sin. However, that doesn't mean it's also always acceptable, all right? Because the answer of whether or not drinking is a sin really depends on the situation and the person who's doing the drinking, okay? Now, there are some people who say that the wine in ancient times had no alcohol in it. Okay, that nobody in the Bible, none of the disciples, Jesus himself never drank alcoholic wine. That's the assertion that people make, and honestly, I think it's a little bit ridiculous to believe that. Okay, because we know grape juice was stored in wineskins. Okay, it has the word wine in it, right? And Jesus talks about this himself in Luke 5:37. He says, "And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the new wine will burst the skins, and it will be spilled, and the skins will be destroyed. But new wine must be put into fresh wineskins." Let me ask you a question, church. Does anyone know what happens in a wineskin that makes them expand and burst? The fermentation process, aka the creation of alcohol, right? All grapes have yeast and it will always turn into alcohol. And this process begins within 24 hours. And the first stage to complete it only takes 5 days. I have a lot of trouble believing that everyone drank an entire harvest worth of juice in 23 hours, right? That means that no, they were drinking alcohol. When Jesus drank wine, he was consuming alcohol. There's virtually no doubt there. However, there are some things that we should understand about kind of winemaking and what they did. Distillation methods weren't invented for another 800 years after Jesus walked the earth. So that means none of the disciples were drinking bourbon or vodka or whiskey or anything like that, okay? Matter of fact, their wine wasn't chemically fermented like ours can be. They probably didn't add extra sugar, which means they couldn't get above the 12% alcohol line, unlike some of our modern wines that can be more than twice that. Although I was told this morning by a winemaker that 12% is the legal limit for being called a wine. Any more than that, you have to call it something else. Just a little fact for you to take home. But not just that, right? So they're not drinking any more than 12% alcohol in their wine, right? And that was their only option. But not only that, but most ancient cultures, including Jewish culture, felt that drinking straight wine was a barbaric act. They would never do it. So they usually diluted their wine with water before they drank it. The Mishnah, the Talmud, the Apocrypha all have procedures for diluting wine. And most people seem to go for 2 parts water to 1 part wine. But the Mishnah actually says that 3 parts water to 1 part wine was the best way to do it, which means their alcohol was about 3%. Okay, that is so low that there are areas in the United States today that if you have 3% alcohol, they won't sell it as an alcoholic beverage. It's just a regular beverage because 3% is so low, all right? Now, why does that matter? Why does it matter that their wine didn't have a lot of alcohol and that was their only option? Well, simple. It was way harder to get drunk in ancient times. It was way harder to get drunk. Today it's like, oh shoot, I took 3 shots, now I'm drunk. And back then it was like, oh shoot, I just drank 5 gallons and I'm starting to feel something, right? It was a different world. It was a different situation. And that matters because of your second fill in the blank, church. Number 2, today's temptations are more powerful, available, and culturally acceptable. Now, this is true for alcohol, but this is true for other things as well. It's easier to be a glutton today because we have preservatives and shipping and a McDonald's on every corner. It's easier to be an adulterer today because we have pornography and birth control and things like that. It's easier to be a sloth because we have things that are delivered to our door. We have government assistance, okay? Now, here's the thing. Preservatives, birth control, delivery, all those things by themselves aren't bad things. However, if you abuse those things, bad things start to happen. And that's the same issue with alcohol. The Bible does not say that drinking wine is inherently sinful, but alcohol can be a very dangerous substance for many reasons. And here's probably the biggest one, your third fill in the blank. Trusting alcohol is a poor substitute for trusting God. Now, you might be thinking, trusting alcohol. What do you mean trusting alcohol? How do you trust alcohol? How do you trust a drink? Well, think about what George Bailey just said in that video. You know what I need? I need a couple of stiff drinks. Oh, well, what did the bartender say? Well, if I am remembering Chris's lines from the play coming up in a couple of weeks, he says, hey, we serve hard liquor for folks that want to get drunk fast. Right? So when you want to change the way you feel, what you're thinking, to cope with pain, to cope with stress, or even to cope with success, sometimes we lean on alcohol to handle those things. Sometimes it makes us more social or more brave. We like ourselves better when we act like a drunk person than our normal selves. That's why we call it liquid courage. It becomes something that people lean on when they need something. And matter of fact, some people lean on it too much and too often, and their body starts to physically need it as well, to the point that stopping cold turkey will cause withdrawals that will literally kill you. And so Noah's story warns us that even those who have been faithful to God, people have seen God's power and his faithfulness in their lives, can fall into the trap of trusting something other than God to help them get through something. I believe personally the reason Noah is drinking in this moment is to help him cope. And who wouldn't understand that? Think about it. Noah's family are the last people on earth. Imagine being the last person on earth. You will never meet a new person until your grandkids come along. To start, there's only 2 of every animal, so you can't even eat meat. You only eat vegetables. Do what you want with that information. You basically have to completely start over. So you think Noah might be a little depressed? His extended family and all of his friends, they're all dead. He's all by himself. Is that depressing? Yeah. He has to repopulate the whole world and rebuild civilization from scratch. You think that might be a little stressful? I think so. So that's why he's thinking like George Bailey, man, I need a drink. But here's the problem. Even though alcohol or whatever can seem to offer temporary relief, it's never a good substitute for God. And what's worse is Noah's drunkenness doesn't just affect him, it also impacts his family too. You know, when we use substances to numb our pain or satisfy our desires, we put ourselves at risk. But we also invite dysfunction into our relationships and into our communities. So what do we do with this question of alcohol? What do we do with it? Let me ask again, is drinking a sin? Well, the answer is, it depends. Not all consumption of alcohol is sinful. As I said, drinking wine was a very common activity for Israel, the disciples, and even Jesus himself. However, some drinking is a sin. And let's look at what that might be. First of all, drinking too much is almost definitely, impossibly not a sin, okay? It's almost a guarantee that it is sinful to drink too much. Ephesians 5:18 says, "And do not get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit." Isaiah 5:11 says, "Woe to those who rise early in the morning that they may run after strong drink, who tarry late into the evening and wine inflames them." Proverbs 20, verse 1 says, "Wine is a mocker, strong drink is a brawler, and whoever is led astray by it is not wise." More than 70 times the Bible tells us, don't get drunk. It's foolish, it's a mistake, it's a sin. Matter of fact, somebody who drinks too much is automatically disqualified from being an elder or a deacon in a church. And so far we know this. We're going to keep a list of the sinful drinking situations. Number one, getting drunk is a sin. Okay? But drinking without getting drunk may not be. But notice I said may not be. Doesn't mean always, okay? Because sometimes drinking without getting drunk is also a sin. Did you know that? Let me show you what I mean. Now, before we hop into that, at this point, you might be wondering, well, Pastor Dan, do you drink? Anybody wondering that right now? I don't have to tell you. We'll just move on to the next point. Are you curious? If you're not, I don't have to tell you. Okay. So, I do drink, but not very much. And here's why. While there's nothing wrong with me having a drink every so often, to me, it's just not important. It's just not something that I hold at a very high esteem, okay? I'll put it to you this way. If I found out I was no longer allowed to wear pink zebra print t-shirts with Comic Sans font on the front, that wouldn't bother me at all. But that would bother me more than not drinking ever again. Okay, it's just not important to me, all right? However, since there is nothing wrong with it, I will have a glass during a meal at a special occasion or something like that, all right? I think this entire last year, I think I've had a total of 4 drinks, I think, all right? If you would have asked me this same question 2 years ago, I would have said, I don't think I've had a drink in 7 years, because it just wasn't important to me. It's just not. So, like in this last year, 4 times during, I think, Valentine's Day, anniversary, right? So it's like I'll have 1 glass, okay? It's just not important to me. But another rule that I have for myself is outside of a special dinner in a restaurant like that, I won't drink around here. And I don't just mean I won't drink in the parking lot. I mean like in the general Peoria area, okay? I won't drink around here. Because the reason is I don't want somebody who knows I'm a pastor seeing me drink in public and without having a conversation with me say, oh, well, Dan's a pastor and he drinks, so it must be okay for me. Okay? Because I don't want to communicate that. Because just because it's okay for me does not mean it's okay for you. And now you might be thinking, well, wait a second. That's not fair. How come you can have a drink, but I can't have a drink? Well, let's talk about that. Okay? This morning, I don't care about letting you guys know that I do have a drink every so often because we get to have this conversation. All right? And here's the thing. Each person's situation is different. Some people have a weakness when it comes to alcohol, okay? And not only that, some people have a personal, God-given conviction about alcohol, all right? And this wouldn't be a rule that you get to make for other people. This is a personal conviction that you follow yourself. If either of those people drink, it is a sin, all right? So far we know this. Number 1, getting drunk is a sin. Number 2, an alcoholic drinking is a sin. And number 3, drinking against God's conviction is a sin. So the third thing is drinking against God's conviction is a sin. Now you might be asking yourself, well, how do I know if I have a problem here? Okay? Well, there's actually a very simple baseline test to figure out if you have a drinking problem. All right? It's not perfect, but it's pretty simple. All right? Here's the thing. If your drinking negatively affects your work situation, your legal status, your relationships, that could be family, friends, God, right? Or the health and safety of yourself or others, then you likely have a problem. Okay? Now, of course, that's in addition to numbers 1 and 3 that we've already looked at. All right? Alcohol should always fall underneath those things as far as priority is concerned. Okay? Drinking should never be more important to you than your job. It should not be more important to you than your family. It should not be more important to you than the safety of other people, like when you're driving a car. And honestly, if you're asking yourself those questions, just being honest, right? Do I have a problem? Does my drinking negatively affect those things? We shouldn't be making excuses there, right? Saying things like, oh, but I only have one DUI. Or my wife says I drink too much, but she's just judgmental. Or I only call off on most Mondays, not every Monday. Or, well, there was only one time I passed out and my toddler was playing with the stove. If that's you, you should absolutely be taking a hard look at yourself and asking that question. Do I have a problem? Do I need to do something about this? But just wait, church, there's more. We learn about this when Paul is talking about these types of situations in the book of Romans. In Romans 14:13, he says this, "Therefore, let us not pass judgment on one another any longer, but rather decide never to put a stumbling block or hindrance in the way of a brother. I know and am persuaded in the Lord Jesus that nothing is unclean in itself, but it is unclean for anyone who thinks it's unclean." Okay? So that last sentence there, it's unclean for anyone who thinks it's unclean. That's the convictional part I'm talking to you about. If God makes you feel like drinking is unclean in your heart, then you shouldn't be drinking. Okay? But it also says for us not to pass judgment on people that are different than us in that way, because there's nothing unclean about it other than what's in your own personal heart. Okay? So we've seen the alcoholic issue, we've seen the personal conviction issue, and for me, I'm not an alcoholic, and I don't have a conviction to be judged over. Okay? I can have one drink and stop without any challenge. I can also have no drinks when other people are around me, and it just doesn't bother me at all. But then we hit this fourth thing here. Notice that Paul says not to put a stumbling block in front of a brother. So that means if you're hanging out with someone who has an issue with alcohol, drinking in front of them could bring them to a point of temptation. Okay? And Romans 14:21 tells us, "It is not good to eat meat or drink wine or do anything that causes your brother to stumble." So that means that if we know that me sitting in front of this person who's an alcoholic and having a drink will encourage them to stumble, then I shouldn't be drinking. And your response to that might be, well, wait a second, I'm not the one with the problem, so why do I have to change my behavior for them? That's their problem, not mine. Well, the answer to that question is simple. Because it's an act of love. It's loving when you're sitting with an alcoholic to not drink in front of them. In 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about a similar issue. He's talking about food being sacrificed to idols, but that's why meat was mentioned in the other passage. So it's all one thought. It's the same basic thought. And so by your knowledge, this weak person is destroyed, the brother for whom Christ died. Thus, sinning against your brother and wounding their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. So church, it's important that we be willing to forego something that we would normally have a right to do in order to lovingly support those who do not have a right because they are convicted or addicted. So what have we learned about the sin of drinking alcohol? Number 1, getting drunk is a sin. Number 2, an alcoholic drinking is a sin. Number 3, drinking against God's conviction is a sin. And number 4, causing a brother to stumble by drinking is a sin. Okay? But here's the thing. It's like, okay, so then when is it okay? Right? I mean, that's a lot of rules, right? It seems like there's a lot of points up there. So when can I have a drink? Well, simple. 1 Corinthians 10:31 tells us, "So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all to the glory of God." Before you do any sort of drinking, are you doing it for the glory of God? It's an important question. It's okay to have a drink or two while you're celebrating something. That's not the point. But then we also have to ask ourselves other questions. Do we trust God to give us peace in moments of anxiety, or are we turning to something like alcohol to help us numb the pain? Because that's unhealthy behavior. Do we trust God to help us celebrate and enjoy life, or are we turning to a substance so we can escape reality? Do we trust that God's plan for our lives is better than this temporary high, or do we just turn to the bottle anyway? And in Noah's case, his choice to drink was clearly the sinful kind, right? It's obvious that he drank to excess. He passed out naked. And I think he was doing it because he was using alcohol to cope with his struggles. When he should have been leaning on God in his moment of depression and struggle, instead he chose to lean on a substance and just pass out. And in the end, it was devastating for his family. And church, here's your fourth and final fill in the blank this morning. Sinful drinking can have terrible consequences for relationships. Noah's drunkenness negatively affected his relationship with his son Ham. And don't get me wrong, Ham has his own responsibility here. We'll talk about that. But so does Noah. When Ham saw Noah's nakedness, he went and he told his brothers, and there's a lot of debate over why that was such a problem, okay? Some think that he was just gawking at his dad and making fun of him. Some think that there was some strange sexual fascination there. Some say that he was trying to make his dad look bad to his brothers and put him down. And some even say that Ham used it as a chance to do some weird voodoo-type curse on his dad's fertility in that moment. It doesn't matter what it was exactly. It was clear that whatever it was, that what he was doing was a dishonorable act, right? But when they saw this, Ham's brothers Shem and Japheth took a different approach. They covered up their father's nakedness. They protected his dignity, even going so far as to walk backwards so they wouldn't have to see anything. And ultimately, Noah's reaction was to curse Ham's son, Canaan, which then carries off into the people of Canaan, the Canaanites, which shows how our actions can have lasting consequences, not just for ourselves, but for those around us and even for future generations. And it makes me think about how many families have been ruined by alcoholism, right? The kind that is even passed down from generation to generation to generation, where you get drunk all the time because you saw your dad get drunk all the time because he saw his dad get drunk, right? And it just gets passed down, these bad behaviors. And so we start turning to these substances for ungodly reasons, and that just creates a ripple effect of shame and hurt and division that affects our great-great-great-great-grandchildren. And so what do we learn from this passage then? Well, it's kind of a stark reminder that while alcohol and other substances can seem like an escape, they cannot provide the lasting comfort, healing, or peace that only God can give to us. When we rely on God instead of substances, though, that's when we acknowledge that He is our ultimate source of strength and joy. And that's what God wants. He wants to be our source of life in every moment, whether we're celebrating something good or we're facing life's challenges. Either way, we're supposed to be acknowledging God and leaning on God in those circumstances. And we can best recognize that when we have a sober mind. And the truth is, church, in watching this film, instead of drinking, George Bailey should be turning to God. Think about it. He's going through an incredibly difficult situation. His uncle lost a bunch of money. He's afraid he's going to go to jail. He could turn to God in that moment, but instead he goes to drinks. Now, he does pray to God in that movie, but only after he's had a bunch of drinks. And then, after he gets punched in the face, George Bailey says, "That's what I get for praying." But what George doesn't realize at the time is that God's actually ready to answer his prayer, because he sends this silly little angel named Clarence to help him out. Now, obviously, that's just a movie. God doesn't send dead people from the 1800s to show us what the world would be like if we weren't born, right? It's just a movie. But the reality, church, is that what God really did in real life is way better than anything that could ever be written in a movie. And so, church, my encouragement to you is this isn't just to slap you on the wrist and tell you to quit, never drink again or whatever. No, you have the freedom to drink if you do it in a healthy way. But at the same time, we need to be honest with ourselves when we're struggling with something in this life. Maybe you're an alcoholic. Maybe you have a different addiction. Maybe you have another sin problem, right? We all struggle with that. Alcohol might just happen to be your vice, but we all have something. And the truth is, we need to learn to acknowledge when we're struggling and to get help. In church, there is help out there. You can talk to me after service if you want. You can talk to any one of the elders or the prayer team, right? Because the real answer to all of our problems is Jesus.